The rusted iron gate was a dragon's maw in the pouring midnight rain, and Isla's knuckles were raw from beating against it. Each frantic pound was a prayer swallowed by the storm, a desperate drumbeat against the fortress walls of the Hell's Angels clubhouse. She had run for 3 miles, her lungs burning with icy air and terror, the thin fabric of her sweater plastered to her skin. Behind her, in the sprawling, sterile mansion she had just escaped, was her sister, Seraphina. And with Seraphina was him, Donovan. The thought of his name was a shard of glass in her mind. The distant growl of a car engine sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through her veins. Was it him? Was he already hunting her? She slammed her fist against the cold metal one last time, a sob catching in her throat. "Please," she whispered to the unfeeling steel, her voice a ragged thread. "Please, somebody. He has my sister." The sound of a heavy bolt sliding back was like a gunshot in the night. A sliver of warm, yellow light cut through the deluge, and a mountain of a man filled the gap. He was immense, bearded, clad in leather adorned with patches that seemed to drink the darkness. His eyes, hard as granite, scanned her from head to toe, taking in her drenched, shivering form, the wild terror in her eyes, the bloody scrapes on her hands. This was Grizz, the club's sergeant-at-arms, a man whose silence could crush bone. He'd been cleaning his piece at the bar, the rhythmic slide and click of form of meditation, when he heard the faint, frantic tapping. He'd almost dismissed it as hail, but it was too rhythmic, too desperate. He looked from her terrified face back into the rainy darkness she had emerged from, his gaze lingering as if he could see the monster chasing her. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He'd seen that brand of fear before, and it only came from one place. With a grunt that was more vibration than sound, he stepped back, swinging the heavy gate wide. "Get in," he growled, his voice a low rumble like shifting earth. Now, Isla stumbled past him into the courtyard, the roar of the storm suddenly muffled by the high walls. The air inside was thick with the scent of rain on hot asphalt, old oil, and something else, a feeling of raw, untamed power. She had knocked on the devil's door seeking sanctuary, and the devil had just let her in. Her legs finally gave out, and she collapsed onto the wet ground, the last of her strength gone. Grizz shut and bolted the gate, the sound echoing with grim finality. He loomed over her, not with menace, but with a strange, watchful stillness. He pulled a radio from his belt, his thumb pressing the transmit button. "Jax," he said, his voice flat. "We got a problem at the front gate." "No, not cops. Something worse." He looked down at the crumpled heap of the young woman, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He saw the faint, yellowing bruise peeking out from the collar of her sweater, a ghost of a handprint on her delicate skin. A low, dangerous anger began to simmer in his gut. He had a daughter of his own, grown and safe, but the instinct was primal. The clubhouse door swung open, spilling more light and the faint sound of classic rock into the yard. Jackson Jax Ryder, president of the chapter, stood silhouetted in the doorway. He wasn't as broad as Grizz, but he carried an aura of coiled intensity, his tattooed arms crossed over a chest that was a roadmap of his life. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, were fixed on Isla. "What is it?" Jax asked, his voice gravelly, accustomed to cutting through the roar of a dozen Harleys. Grizz just jerked his chin towards Isla. "She ran here. Through this," he gestured at the storm. "Something's chasing her." Jax walked slowly across the wet pavement, his boots making no sound. He crouched down, bringing himself to her level. The rain dripped from the ends of his dark hair. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to touch her. He just waited. "What's her name?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to his fearsome appearance. Isla looked up, her vision blurred by rain and tears. She saw the skull patch on his leather vest, the words Hell's Angels arching over it like a dark halo. This was it. She had thrown herself on the mercy of monsters to escape a monster. "Isla," she choked out. "My name is Isla, and he has my sister. You have to help me. Please, you're the only ones who can." She didn't know why she believed that, only that the polished, impotent world of law and order had failed them, had been bought and paid for by Donovan's influence. She needed something that couldn't be bought. She needed fire to fight fire. Jax's gaze didn't waver. He saw the truth of her terror, the unvarnished plea of a soul at its breaking point. A flicker of an old, cold memory passed behind his eyes. Another frightened girl, another monster. A promise he had failed to keep. He would not fail again. He nodded slowly. "Grizz," he said, his voice now hard as forged steel. "Bring her inside. Get her warm. Then get the others. We're having a church meeting." The order was absolute. The club was now her shield, and its wrath was about to be unleashed. Inside, the clubhouse was a den of controlled chaos and brotherhood. The air was a potent mix of stale beer, worn leather, engine grease, and cigarette smoke. Chrome gleamed from bike parts mounted on the walls like trophies. A long, scarred wooden bar dominated one side of the room, and a massive table, carved with the initials and road names of generations of members, sat in the center. It was intimidating, overwhelmingly male, but for the first time in months, Isla felt a sliver of safety. Grizz draped a thick, heavy blanket around her shoulders. It smelled of motor oil and sawdust, a strangely comforting scent. Another biker, a wiry man with a quick smile they called Sparky for his electrical genius, pressed a steaming mug of coffee into her trembling hands. They moved around her with a surprising lack of intrusion, giving her space, their gruff curiosity tempered by a silent, collective understanding. Jax led her to the big table, pulling out a chair for her at its head, a place reserved for him. The gesture was not lost on the few members lingering in the room. They watched, their expressions unreadable, as their president treated this terrified stranger with a level of respect usually reserved for an old lady of the club. "Tell me everything," Jax said, sitting opposite her. His voice was calm, a steady anchor in her swirling panic. "Don't leave anything out. Start from the beginning." And so she did. The story tumbled out of her, fragmented and raw. She spoke of Donovan Croft, the charming, wealthy businessman who had swept her older sister, Serafina, off her feet. Serafina, who had been fragile since a car accident years ago left her with chronic pain and crippling anxiety, saw Donovan as her savior. At first, he was attentive, generous, moving them both into his state-of-the-art home in the hills, promising to care for them. Isla had been grateful, but the paradise soon revealed its bars. It started subtly. Comments about her friends, suggestions that Serafina didn't need her old physical therapist anymore because he would take care of her. He slowly, methodically, severed every tie to their old life. The phones were upgraded to a new system he controlled. Mail was screened. Visitors were politely but firmly turned away. For Serafina's peace of mind, he'd say, his smile never quite reaching his cold, possessive eyes. Then came the whispers, the psychological torment. He'd prey on Serafina's anxiety, telling her the world outside was dangerous, that she was only safe with him. He'd tell Isla she was a burden, that her presence was agitating her sister. He never laid a hand on Serafina, not physically. His cruelty was more insidious. He controlled her medication, sometimes withholding it to make her more dependent, more pliable. For Isla, the abuse was more direct. When Serafina wasn't looking, a grip on her arm that was too tight. A corner in a hallway where he would block her path. His body a wall of intimidation. His voice a low hiss. "You're lucky to be here," he'd snarl. "Don't you ever forget it. One word from me, and you're on the street. And who would ever believe you over me?" He was right. He was a benefactor in the community, his name on hospital wings and charity plaques. She was nobody. The breaking point had come that evening. She'd overheard Donovan on the phone with a doctor, not Serafina's regular physician. He was arranging for Serafina to be moved to a private long-term care facility upstate, a place where she would be completely under his control, with no family, no Isla to interfere. He was going to have her sister committed. The finality of it, the cold, clinical way he spoke of disposing of her sister, had shattered Isla's paralysis. While he was in his study, she'd stolen a master key card from a spare wallet grabbed nothing but the sweater she was wearing, and ran. As she finished, her voice trailing off into a hoarse whisper, the clubhouse was silent. The bikers who had gathered, drawn by Grizz's summons, stood like stone statues, their faces grim. They were men who lived by a code, and while that code was often at odds with the law, it had one unbreakable rule: you don't prey on the weak. You don't hurt women. You don't put your hands on those who can't fight back. Isla had not just walked into a biker bar. She had stumbled into a den of sleeping lions and told them a wolf was in a sheep pen. Jax's hands were flat on the table, his knuckles white. His blue eyes were glacial. He was seeing it all again. His own sister, Sarah, her nervous smiles, the long sleeves she wore in the summer. The slick, charming boyfriend he had never trusted. The phone call that came too late. He had been a prospect then, young and powerless, unable to convince his family or the law that the bruises were anything but accidents. He had found her after the monster she was with had finally tired of his toy. By then, it was over. He had carried that failure, that burning, helpless rage for 15 years. It was the fuel that had forged him into the man he was today, the president who ruled with an iron fist and a core of relentless, protective justice. He looked at Isla, her face pale and tear-streaked, and saw a chance for a different ending. "Grizz," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What do we know about this Donovan Croft?" Grizz stepped forward, his face a thundercloud. "Seen his car around. A black Bentley. Custom plates. He owns Croft Development. Big money. Got his hands on a lot of pies, mostly legit on the surface. But there are whispers. Union problems that just disappear. Competitors who suddenly back out of deals. He's got friends in the DA's office. Untouchable, they say." Jax gave a humorless smile. "Everybody can be touched." He stood up, his presence filling the room. He turned to face his men, his brothers in leather and steel. "This isn't club business," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "This isn't about territory or money. This is about who we are. We don't let things like this stand. Not in our town. Not on our watch." He paused, his gaze sweeping over each man. "This guy Croft, he lives in a fortress up on Sentinel Hill. He's got money, he's got connections, he's got private security. Going after him is risky. It'll bring heat. Bad heat." He let the warning hang in the air, a final chance for anyone to back away. No one moved. No one even breathed. The loyalty in the room was a tangible force, a solid wall of leather and resolve. "I'm not ordering anyone," Jax continued. "This is a choice. But I'm going. I'm going to get her sister. And I'm going to make this man understand what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness." Grizz was the first to speak, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. "I'm with you." Prez, another biker, preacher, so named for his uncanny ability to quote scripture before a fight, nodded grimly. "The wicked shall fall into their own nets. One by one, they voiced their assent. And count on it, let's ride." It was a council of war, a declaration from a sovereign nation of outlaws. They were about to go to war with a man who thought he was a king, and they were going to tear his kingdom down. Jax turned back to Isla. The hard lines of his face had softened, but the fire in his eyes burned brighter than ever. "We're going to get her back," he said. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact. "Sparky, I want eyes on that place. Everything. Digital and physical. How many cameras? What kind of system? Server locations. I want to know when the garbage gets picked up." Sparky grinned, a flash of white in his scruffy beard. "Already on it, boss. Give me an hour. I'll have his digital footprint mapped back to his first dial-up modem." "Grizz," Jax continued. "You and me were doing a drive-by. A slow one. I want to see the physical layout. Access roads, fence height, patrol routines. Preacher, Ghost, you're with us. Different vehicle. We go in pairs, low profile. The clubhouse transformed from a lounge into a tactical operations center. Maps were spread across the pool table. Laptops flickered to life. The men moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency that spoke of years of operating outside the lines. Isla watched, Miss Medisith. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was now overshadowed by a new, unfamiliar feeling. Hope. A fierce, dangerous hope. backed by the rumbling thunder of a dozen angry men. She was no longer alone. She had an army. The reconnaissance began before the sun even threatened the horizon. Grizz drove a battered, nondescript pickup truck, the kind that blended into any working-class neighborhood, its bed filled with old tarps and empty paint cans. Jack sat in the passenger seat, looking like any other construction worker on his way to an early job, a thermos of coffee in his hand. But his eyes missed nothing. They circled the sprawling estate on Sentinel Hill, a monument to modern architecture and paranoia. A 10-foot concrete wall, topped with angled steel and what looked like motion-sensing laser grids, surrounded the entire property. A single, formidable gate, manned by 2 armed guards in a reinforced booth, was the only visible entrance. Fort Knox with a better view, Grizz muttered, his hands relaxed on the wheel, his demeanor utterly casual. Cameras every 20 feet on the perimeter, Jax observed, his gaze methodical. Thermal, most likely, the kind that picks up a rabbit farting in a snowstorm. The guards look like ex-military, probably from one of those high-end private security firms. As they completed their second pass, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled out of the gate, turning down the hill. Jax's eyes narrowed. He memorized the license plate instinctively. That's not local security. Those are his personal dogs, inside the house. Donovan Croft was a tempest of controlled fury. He discovered Isla's absence an hour after her escape. The missing keycard confirmed she hadn't just gone for a walk. He had Serafina in the living room, a cashmere blanket wrapped around her, a cup of chamomile tea on the table beside her. He was the picture of concern. "I'm just worried, my love," he said, his voice a smooth caress. Isla is so impulsive, running off like that in the middle of the night. It's not safe, Serafina, her anxiety already heightened by the disruption, wrung her hands. She's never done this before. Maybe I should call her phone. I've tried, darling, Donovan lied smoothly. It goes straight to voicemail. She probably dropped it and it broke. Don't you worry. My men are out looking for her. We'll find her, he smiled, but his eyes were chips of ice. He knew exactly what had happened. Isla had heard him on the phone. The little rat had finally grown a spine. His first instinct was rage, a desire to smash something, to punish. But he was a man of discipline. Panic was for the weak. He would handle this. He would find Isla, and he would bring her back. And when he did, he would make an example of her that would ensure Serafina never, ever dreamed of defiance. His phone buzzed. It was the head of his security team. "Sir, we have a problem. There's been a breach in the digital firewall. It's sophisticated." Therein, Donovan's knuckles went white as he gripped the phone. "What did they get?" "It's hard to say, sir. They were a ghost. They mirrored the security feeds and downloaded the system architecture before we could lock them out. They saw everything. Camera placements, patrol schedules, alarm protocols. A cold fury settled over Donovan. This wasn't some runaway girl's panicked plea to the police. This was professional. This was an attack. And in that moment, he knew. He didn't know how, but somehow, the little gutter rat had found wolves. "Double the patrols," he ordered, his voice dangerously low. "Army internal response team. I want this house locked down. No one in or out without my direct authorization. And find her. I don't care what it takes. Find Isla." Back at the clubhouse, Sparky was beaming. "Piece of cake," he said, pointing to a complex diagram on his laptop screen. Their firewall was good, but it was corporate good, not pissed-off biker with a government surplus server good. "I've got full schematics of the house. Electrical, plumbing, HVAC. I even know what brand of toilet paper he uses. More importantly, I found a blind spot." He pointed to a section of the wall on the north side of the property, bordering a steep, wooded embankment. "There's a sewer access tunnel that runs right under the perimeter wall. It's old, predates the house. Not on any of his fancy new blueprints. It comes out right next to the generator housing. If we can get through that, we're inside the wire." Jax studied the map, his mind a whirlwind of tactical calculations. A plan began to form, a symphony of violence and stealth. "It's a two-phase operation," he announced to the assembled group. "Phase 1 is infiltration. Grizz, you, me, and Ghost. We go in through that tunnel tonight. Sparky, you'll be our eyes and ears, running digital interference. You create a loop on the cameras covering that sector. Just before we move, he turned to Preacher. You lead phase 2. The cavalry. You and the rest of the boys will be staged a mile out. When I give the signal, you come. You come fast, and you come loud. Hit the front gate. That's the diversion. You draw the guards, all of them. We use the chaos to get the sister and get out. As he spoke, a memory, sharp and unwanted, pierced through his concentration. He was 22 again, standing on a cold linoleum floor in a hospital waiting room. The smell of antiseptic. The hushed, pitying voices of the nurses. His father was a wreck, his mother sedated. He was the one who had to identify Sarah. He remembered the long sleeves she'd been wearing, even in the morgue. He had pushed one up just to know for sure. The bruises were there, old and new, a constellation of her silent suffering. He hadn't seen. He had been too busy with the club, with prospecting, with trying to be a tough guy. He had failed to see the real monster, the one who wore a suit and a charming smile. He clenched his jaw, the memory fueling the cold fire in his belly. This time, he would not be too late. This time, the monster would be the one to feel helpless. Meanwhile, another flashback tormented Isla. She was huddled in a corner of the clubhouse, the heavy blanket still around her, but the chill she felt was deep in her bones. She remembered the week before. Donovan had been angry about a business deal that had soured. He hadn't yelled. He never yelled. He had taken his rage out on the house. In a terrifyingly silent fury, he had walked into the formal dining room and methodically, one by one, smashed every piece of the priceless porcelain dinner set Serafina's grandmother had left her. Serafina had collapsed into sobs, begging him to stop. Donovan had simply looked at her, his face a blank mask, and said, "Things can be replaced." But disloyalty is a stain that never washes out. He had then looked directly at Isla, his eyes promising that she was just as breakable as the china. That was the moment she knew he was capable of anything. That was the moment the fear had turned into a desperate, primal need to escape. Inside the mansion, Serafina felt that same fear. Donovan's mood had shifted. The mask of concern was gone, replaced by an unnerving stillness. He had taken her phone. To keep a charge for when Isla calls, he'd said. He had locked the door to her bedroom from the outside. For her own safety, she was a prisoner. She sat on her bed, hugging a pillow to her chest, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of extra men moving through the house. She thought of Isla, out there somewhere in the dark, and for the first time in years, a tiny spark of her sister's defiance flickered within her. She had to be ready. If Isla had found a way out, she might find a way back in. Serafina slid off the bed and limped to her closet. Behind a stack of shoeboxes was the emergency kit Isla had insisted they keep, a relic from their earthquake preparedness days in California. Inside was a small, powerful flashlight and a multi-tool. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a weapon. The night deepened, the storm passing, leaving behind a sky of bruised clouds and a chilling wind. The time was set, 2 Uhr nachts, the deadest point of the night, when security would be at its most complacent. Jax, Grizz, and Ghost, a wiry, silent biker known for his stealth, were clad in black from head to toe. They carried no firearms. Guns were too loud, too messy. They carried knives, garrotes, and the heavy, hardened knuckles of their own fists. They moved through the woods bordering Croft's property like wraiths, their boots making no sound on the damp earth. "Sparky, we're in position," Jax whispered into a small, encrypted radio. "How we looking?" "All quiet on the western front," Sparky's voice crackled back. "Security feed is looping. You got a 7-minute window before the system auto-resets. Go." Grizz used a crowbar to pry the heavy iron sewer grate from its housing with a low groan of protesting metal. A foul stench wafted up. "Smells better than my last cellmate," he quipped, his attempt at gallows humor cutting the tension. Ghost was the first one down, his slender frame disappearing into the blackness without a ripple. Jax followed, then Grizz, who lowered himself in with surprising agility for a man his size. They pulled the grate back into place above them. They were in. The tunnel was claustrophobic, the air thick and cold. They moved by the faint red light of tactical headlamps, their footsteps splashing in the inches of stagnant water. It was a long, grim journey, but just as Sparky's map had promised, they found the access ladder that led up into the generator housing. Jax went up first, pushing the manhole cover aside a bare inch, listening. He heard the low hum of the massive diesel generator and the rhythmic footsteps of a single guard on a patrol route. He waited for the footsteps to recede. Clear, he breathed. They emerged into a small concrete room, a spiderweb of conduits and wires covering the walls. They were inside the perimeter. According to the blueprint in Jax's head, the main house was 50 yards to the east, across an open lawn. A single camera swept the area. "Sparky, we need another loop," Jax whispered. "Camera 4, North Lawn, working on it," came the reply. "He's beefed up his internal network. This is trickier." By me 30 seconds, just then, the door to the generator room swung open. A security guard stood there, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw the 3 black-clad figures. He didn't even have time to raise his weapon. Ghost moved like a blur, a shadow detaching from the wall. He covered the man's mouth with one hand while his other arm wrapped around his throat in a sleeper hold. The guard struggled for a few seconds, his boots kicking uselessly, before slumping unconscious. Grizz caught him, lowering him gently to the floor. "Nighty-night," he grunted, binding the man's hands and feet with zip ties and stuffing a gag in his mouth. 30 seconds is up," Sparky's voice crackled. "Camera 4 is a pretty picture of an empty lawn. You're clear to the house." Move, they melted back into the shadows, crossing the manicured lawn like panthers. The house loomed over them, a monolith of dark glass and steel. Jax found the access panel for the HVAC system, exactly where Sparky said it would be. Ghost, a former cat burglar before he found the Brotherhood of the club, made short work of the lock. A moment later, they were inside a maintenance duct, the cold, conditioned air of the house washing over them. They were in the belly of a beast. The ductwork was a tight squeeze, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees. Jax led the way, navigating by memory of the blueprints. He could hear the faint, ambient sounds of the house, the hum of a refrigerator, the creak of the building settling, and something else, a low murmur of voices. He paused, holding up a hand to halt the others. He pressed his ear to the metal vent above him. It was Donovan's voice, smooth and venomous. "Completely unacceptable. You find her. I don't care if you have to tear this city apart brick by brick." There was a pause. "No, she's secure. She's not going anywhere." Jax's blood ran cold. He had Serafina. They were close. He moved on, faster now, the rage building in his chest a controlled cold burn. They reached the vent that Sparky had identified as being closest to the master suite. Jax carefully unscrewed the grate. The room below was a guest bedroom, empty and pristine. They dropped down, one by one, silent as falling leaves. They were in the main living quarters. The house was an eerie cathedral of wealth and fear. Polished marble floors, abstract art on the walls, everything cold and impersonal. They moved down the hallway, a silent trio of avenging angels. Jax held up a hand, pointing to a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. 2 of Donovan's personal thugs stood guard, armed with pistols and shoulder holsters. They looked bored, complacent. This was the moment. Jax looked at Grizz, who grinned a wolfish grin. Jax held up 2 fingers. On his signal, they moved. It wasn't a fight, it was a removal. Jax took the man on the left, Grizz the one on the right. Jax's hand clamped over his target's mouth, his other hand driving the butt of his heavy knife into the man's temple. The thug crumpled without a sound. Grizz's method was more direct. He simply grabbed his man by the throat and the back of the head and slammed his face into the wall with a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. The man slid to the floor, a broken puppet. Ghost was already at the door, his lock-picking tools a silver blur in the dim light. The lock clicked open. Jax pushed the door open slowly. Serafina was inside, huddled on the far side of the bed. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror. She saw the 3 large, menacing figures and opened her mouth to scream. Before she could, Jax put a finger to his lips, his blue eyes holding hers. He wasn't the monster she was expecting. He pointed back towards the hallway, then to himself and his men, and then made a gesture of breaking chains. He was here to get her out. Understanding, fragile but real, dawned in her eyes. She nodded, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob of relief. Just as Ghost moved to help her up, the door to the adjoining bathroom burst open. Donovan Croft stood there, a 9mm pistol in his hand. He wasn't surprised. He was furious. His eyes blazed with a possessive, incandescent rage. Behind him stood 2 more of his heavily armed goons. "I knew you'd come," Donovan hissed, his voice trembling with fury. He leveled the gun not at Jax, but at Serafina. "But you're too late. She's mine. And if I can't have her, no one can drop it, Croft," Jax said, his voice a low growl. He and Grizz moved to flank him, putting themselves between Donovan and Serafina. "It's over," Donovan laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "Over? It's just getting started," he fired. Not at Jax, but at the ceiling. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. It was a signal. Alarms blared throughout the house. "You see," Donovan sneered, his face a mask of triumphant madness. "You thought you were the hunters. But you just walked into my trap." The room erupted into chaos. Donovan's 2 goons charged forward. Grizz met the first one with a roar, his massive frame a battering ram of pure force. They crashed into a wardrobe, shattering the wood. The second goon went for Jax, swinging a heavy fist. Jax ducked under it, his movements fluid and economical. He drove his elbow into the man's ribs, then followed with a brutal series of strikes to his throat and face. The man staggered back, gasping, and Jax finished him with a powerful kick that sent him crashing into a glass-topped table. Ghost, meanwhile, had one job: the package. He grabbed Serafina, shielding her with his body, and began moving her towards the window. It overlooked a balcony, a sheer drop to the flagstones below, but it was their only way out. Donovan, seeing his prize being taken, screamed in rage and fired again. The bullet ricocheted off the wall, inches from Ghost's head. Jack saw his chance. While Donovan was focused on Ghost, he lunged. He crashed into Croft, not trying to disarm him, but to drive him back, to put him on the defensive. They slammed against the wall, a tangle of limbs and fury. Donovan was strong, his rage giving him a wiry power, but Jax was fueled by 15 years of burning regret. This was for Sarah. He smashed his forehead into Donovan's nose. There was a wet crack and blood sprayed. Donovan howled, his grip on the gun loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all Jax needed. He twisted the weapon from Croft's hand, tossing it away, and then he unleashed a torrent of brutal, disciplined violence. It wasn't a brawl. It was a dismantling. Each punch was precise, targeted, meant to break and disable. He was taking the monster apart, piece by piece. Below, in the courtyard, the roar of a dozen Harley-Davidsons shattered the night. Preacher and the cavalry had arrived. They hit the front gate like a tidal wave of chrome and steel. The security guards, distracted by the internal alarms, were caught completely off guard. The gate buckled under the impact of 2 bikes hitting it at full speed. Bikers poured into the compound, a whirlwind of black leather and righteous fury. It was the perfect diversion. The remaining security, hearing the assault at the gate, were drawn away from the house, rushing towards a fight they couldn't possibly win. Back in the bedroom, Grizz finished his opponent, leaving the man unconscious in the wreckage of the wardrobe. He turned just in time to see Ghost get the balcony door open. "Jax, time to go," Grizz yelled over the din. Jax delivered one final, devastating punch to Donovan's jaw. Croft's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed, a broken mess on his expensive rug. Jax didn't spare him a second glance. He grabbed a rope and grappling hook from Ghost's pack. It was a desperate plan, but their only one. Ghost secured the hook to the heavy iron railing of the balcony and helped a terrified but resolute Serafina begin the perilous descent. Grizz went next, covering her from above. "Go!" Jax ordered Ghost. "Get her the bikes. We'll hold them off." Just as Ghost disappeared over the edge, More of Croft's men appeared in the hallway, drawn by the sounds of the fight. Jax and Grizz stood shoulder to shoulder in the doorway, a wall of pure defiance. "None shall pass," Grizz growled, cracking his bloody knuckles. What followed was a brutal, close-quarters battle. Jax and Grizz fought like cornered bears, a seamless dance of violence honed by years of watching each other's backs. They held the narrow doorway, a choke point that nullified the enemy's numbers. Fists flew, bodies slammed against walls, and the sounds of the fight were a grim symphony of effort and pain. Down below, Ghost got Serafina to the ground just as the first of the bikes roared around the side of the house. Preacher was at the lead, his face set in a grim mask. "We've got her," Ghost yelled. "Let's go." Preacher scooped Serafina up, settling her in front of him on the bike with a surprising gentleness. "Hold on tight, sister," he said, his voice a reassuring rumble. A few other bikers formed a protective circle around them, their engines revving, a promise of thunderous escape. Up on the balcony, Jax knew they were out of time. "Grizz now," he yelled. They broke from the doorway, making a mad dash for the balcony. A bullet whizzed past Jax's ear. He didn't flinch. They threw themselves over the railing, sliding down the rope in a controlled fall, landing hard on the grass below. They were bruised, bleeding, but they were out. "Go! Go! Go!" Jax screamed, sprinting towards the sound of the engines. They vaulted onto the backs of waiting bikes, the riders gunning the throttles before they were even fully seated. The entire club pulled out as one, a roaring, metallic beast retreating back into the night. They left behind a scene of utter chaos, a breached gate, unconscious guards, a wrecked mansion, and a broken king lying bleeding on his bedroom floor. The ride back to the clubhouse was a blur of wind and adrenaline. The pack of Harleys moved as a single entity, a rolling fortress of steel and brotherhood, with Serafina safe in the center. When they roared into the club's courtyard, Isla was waiting, her face a pale mask of anxiety. The moment she saw Serafina, alive and safe, being helped off Preacher's bike, a choked sob of pure relief escaped her. The two sisters ran to each other, clinging together in the middle of the yard, surrounded by exhausted, grime-covered bikers. Their reunion was a silent, desperate affirmation of love and survival. The clubhouse transformed again, this time into a field hospital. A few of the bikers were patched up by the club's unofficial medic, an old lady named Maria who had been a nurse in a former life. She tended to Jax's split lip and Grizz's bruised ribs with a practiced, no-nonsense tenderness. She then turned her attention to the sisters, checking them for injuries, her calm presence a balm on their frayed nerves. Serafina had a few scrapes from the descent, but was otherwise unharmed physically. The real wounds, the ones on the inside, would take much longer to heal. Jax watched them from across the room, leaning against the bar, a bottle of beer in his hand. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in 15 years. Peace. He had faced the ghost of his failure, and this time, he had won. Grizz limped over and clapped him on the shoulder, his heavy hand a gesture of profound respect. "You did good, Prez," he said, his voice low. "Real good." Jax just nodded, taking a long pull from his beer. "We all did. The fight was over, but the war wasn't." Donovan Croft was not the kind of man to let this go. He had resources, connections, and a sociopathic need for revenge. The club was safe for now, its walls a sanctuary, but the outside world was still dangerous. The next few days were a period of quiet consolidation and healing. The clubhouse remained on lockdown, with sentries posted around the clock. Inside, a strange domesticity settled over the den of outlaws. The bikers gave the sisters space, but their protective presence was constant. Sparky worked tirelessly, scrubbing their digital footprints, creating new identities, and setting up encrypted lines of communication. Preacher found a therapist for Serafina, a trusted contact who understood discretion. Isla, however, was not content to be a passive victim. The fire that had driven her to the Angel's Gate was still burning. After 2 days of rest, she sought out Jax. She found him in the garage, a vast, oil-scented space where the real soul of the club resided. He was working on his bike, a classic panhead, his hands surprisingly steady and precise, cleaning a carburetor part with a small brush. "I need to thank you," Isla began, her voice quiet but firm. "You saved us. You saved my sister's life." Jax didn't look up from his work. "We did what needed to be done. It's more than that," she insisted. "You risked everything for strangers." He finally stopped, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at her, his blue eyes searching her face. He saw not the terrified girl who had collapsed at his gate, but a young woman with a core of tempered steel. "Not strangers," he said softly. "Not anymore. You came to us for help. That makes you our responsibility. That's the code." "I don't want to be a responsibility," she said, her chin held high. "I want to help. I know him. I know how he thinks. I know his business, the people he deals with, the legitimate ones and the other ones. I can help you bring him down. For good." Jax studied her for a long moment. He saw her resolve, her intelligence, her burning need for justice. He saw a reflection of the same fire that drove him. He gave a slow, approving nod. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you know." And so, the final phase of the war began. It was not a war of fists and engines, but one of information and strategy. Guided by Isla's intimate knowledge of Donovan's empire, the club began to dismantle it. An anonymous tip from a burner phone, courtesy of Sparky, led federal investigators to a series of offshore accounts where Donovan was laundering money for a dangerous cartel. Another tip, this one from Isla about a specific warehouse, led the EPA to a massive illegal dumping site for toxic chemicals from Croft construction projects. One by one, the pillars of his kingdom began to crumble. His political friends distanced themselves. His business partners panicked. The media, who had once lauded him as a philanthropist, now circled like sharks, smelling blood. Donovan, trapped in a legal and financial hurricane, was too busy trying to save himself to even think about revenge. He was being systematically erased, not by violence, but by the quiet, relentless pressure of the truth, expertly wielded by the very people he had victimized. During this time, Serafina began to heal. The therapy, the safety of the club, and most importantly, the freedom from Donovan's control, allowed her true self to resurface. The anxiety lessened, replaced by a quiet strength. She started to smile again, a real smile that reached her eyes. She spent hours in the clubhouse kitchen with Maria, learning to cook, the simple, grounding tasks a form of meditation. She found she had a talent for it, and soon the gruff bikers were lining up for Serafina's chili, their compliments a clumsy but heartfelt form of support. Isla found her own place in the club's ecosystem. She had a sharp mind for logistics and began helping Grizz organize the garage's inventory and parts ordering system, bringing a level of efficiency that impressed even the most old-school members. She learned the difference between a shovelhead and a knucklehead, the rhythm of the wrenches and the roar of the engines becoming the soundtrack to her new life. She was no longer a victim waiting to be saved. She was a survivor, a partner, an ally. She had found a family in the most unlikely of places. 3 months after that rainy night, the war was officially over. Donovan Croft, stripped of his wealth and power, was indicted on a dozen federal charges. His face, once plastered on society pages, was now a grim mugshot on the evening news. He would spend the rest of his life in a place with even higher walls than the one he had built for himself. The day the news broke, a quiet celebration was held at the clubhouse. It wasn't a wild party, but a gathering of family. Jax raised his beer bottle. "To justice," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Isla and Serafina, who were sitting at the main table, surrounded by the bikers who had become their protectors, their friends, their brothers. And to new beginnings a few weeks later, Isla and Serafina were ready to leave. They had an apartment in a nearby town, new jobs lined up, a future that was entirely their own. The entire club gathered in the courtyard to see them off. It was a strange, emotional farewell. Grizz gave them both a crushing bear hug. Preacher offered a quiet blessing. Sparky handed them 2 brand-new, completely untraceable cell phones. Finally, Isla stood before Jax. "I don't know how to say goodbye," she said, her eyes welling up. "You don't have to," he replied, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture of profound paternal affection. "This is your home. You're always welcome here. You're one of us now." He pressed a small, folded piece of paper into her hand. It was his private number. "You ever need anything," he said, his gaze unwavering, "you call. The thunder will come." Isla nodded, unable to speak. She and Serafina got into their modest, second-hand car. As they pulled out of the courtyard and onto the open road, a sound rose up behind them. It was the sound of 24 Harley-Davidson engines roaring to life in unison. It wasn't a threat or a warning. It was a salute, an honor guard of outlaw angels. Their rumbling thunder a promise of protection that would follow them wherever they went. They were free, they were safe, and they were strong, forged in a fire they had never asked for, but had survived with the help of the last heroes they ever expected. True strength isn't always found in the light. Sometimes, it's the darkness that teaches you how to fight back. If you believe in the power of brotherhood and the courage to stand up against evil, share this story. Let the world know that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear leather. And for anyone trapped in the dark, know that you are not alone. Keep fighting for the dawn.